everyone, thank you for participating. Today we are completing the Excel Trinity with an introduction to Power Query. Some would argue that Power Query is Excel's best feature, and there's good reason for that, as it lets you automate data cleaning and transformation, among other things. This has the potential to save you a tremendous amount of time, especially when considering that business users spend up to 80% of their time on data preparation, at least according to Microsoft. Power Query is a large topic, particularly if you consider M language. M language is the code that runs everything in Power Query, similar to how we saw DAX operate in Power Pivot in our previous workshop. Today, however, we're going to introduce the user interface and gain some insights into the tools we can start using right away. As a result, the agenda is as follows. We're going to introduce Power Query and how to access it through the Data tab in Excel. We're going to explore the Power Query interface, understand the Power Query workflow, basic transformations, combining data and automating the process for whatever time interval is required. So let's say you get Excel documents from a client, or they're generated internally by an application every week, every month, every quarter. It doesn't matter. You can automate the entire process, and then we can load the data back into Excel. Of course, there's going to be best practices and tips throughout. So let's get started. Where do we find Power Query? There is, after all, nothing that says Power Query in Excel. Well, the way that we access it is through the Data tab, and then we get to the Get and Transform document group. Just like how we explored Power Pivot, and the first step was to ingest some data to work with, the same is true for Power Query. That is why our first step is to get data. So we're going to click on that Get Data dropdown, and you'll see you can pull data from a variety of sources, including Azure, databases, and of course, the one that we are primarily concerned with, from File. So this is going to let you choose either individual workbooks, it's going to let you choose PDF files or folders. So folders is really interesting. We're going to chat a little bit more about that one later in the workshop. Now, at the bottom of the list, we can also see Launch Power Query Editor. This will take us into our UI, and then we can explore this in just a second. But it is worth mentioning that if your data already exists in a sheet, all you have to do is convert it to a table, and then you can click that From Table Range button on our ribbon to ingest it much the same way. Now here we have some data that has been formatted to violate as many rules of clean, structured data as possible. Excel is not Word, and yet data continues to be entered into it as if it was a word processor with multiple headings, empty spaces, blank rows. This is not how data works. Unfortunately, this is the template that is being used by our fictional client, and it means we have to clean up this junk every time it is sent our way, right? Fortunately, no. We're going to create our own document that references this junk workbook with the goal of having it cleaned up automatically for us every single time. So I'm going to close out of this document, and I'm going to open a brand new blank empty workbook. Perfect. Now we have our canvas ready to go. So again, we're going to go to the Get Data dropdown. I'm going to select From File, and again, I will select Excel Workbook. With our local file explorer open, I can now locate our project file, the one we were just looking at, and I'm going to select Import. Once the data scan is complete, we will be presented with the Power Query Navigator displaying all the data that was found in said document. In this case, we can see we have successfully discovered our sheet name called Project. If we had tables or other data, they would have been listed as well with their own unique icons. Now, when I click on the project sheet, we can see a preview of what the data is going to look like. And we can already tell there are loads of problems with it. Look at all of those null statements throughout all of the various cells. And to expand this a little bit further, we have a few empty columns. Great, we will be able to take care of that, no problem. Now, if we divert our gaze to the bottom right, I have two options. I can either load or transform data. If our data was clean, I could load it directly into a data model or a pivot table, or just as a table into my Excel document. However, because our data needs cleaning, we're going to click the transform button first. So this is the Power Query editor that we are going to be looking at primarily today. It is a bit different from what we are used to, but since we have already experimented with Power Pivot, it should look at least a little familiar. Now let me full screen this so we have a little bit more real estate. Our interface is broken down into four main components. The first of which is our ribbon at the top, which comprises of three primary tabs where all of our functionality for this session will come from: Home, Transform, and Add Column. Our Queries panel on the left keeps track of all our connections to data sources. In this case, we only have the projects sheet, which we just pulled in. So if we needed additional screen real estate here, we can press the little arrow to collapse this panel to the left. Now, our data view is our primary center pane. This is where we get real-time visualization of our data as we are manipulating its parameters through our ribbon item. And finally, the query settings. This panel is of immense importance because it shows us the steps we have taken to transform our data. The reason this is important is because the steps are not just there for show, but are actively recorded almost like a macro. And just like a macro, it means that once we have set up the sequence of events correctly, the data will automatically sync with a simple click of the refresh button. We can also point this macro to a different source document, which is what really makes this even more powerful. As long as our source documents use the same formatting, we will only ever have to set this up once. And then all we have to do going forward is point it to the document we need cleaned up, hit the refresh button, and you're done. Now, as you can see, we have items already listed under the applied steps. Why is that? Well, Power Query has already performed some basic transformations as part of our initial data ingestion process. When we click through these steps, it will show us how the data appeared at the onset of each of those steps. For example, if I click into the source, it will show the sheet names available to import. Again, in this case, we only have one. Now, navigation, if I click on that, it's going to show us the outcome of picking our source and the data as it currently exists in its raw form. Promoted headers is Power Query trying to be smart and upgrading our top level row as our header row, which in this case is completely wrong because our poorly formatted source document. And finally, changed type is a follow-up step to promoted headers, where again, Power Query tries to classify what type of data is being held in each column. So for example, currency would be for currency columns, plain text would be for plain text columns. But again, because our columns are poorly formatted, all it really did was change everything to generic data. Now, if we wanted to make changes to any of these steps, we could click on the cog to the right and make our modifications. For example, if I had additional sources, I could click on the navigation cog, and let me do that really quick, and it would let me choose which resource I was interested in, or click on the folder to select them all. When I demonstrate how to load a completely different source a little bit later in the workshop, I will do this with our source step. But in this case, what we want to do is get rid of the incorrect steps Power Query has already inserted for us. So I'll cancel out of this window. And we can do this by clicking the X to the left of each of these steps that we no longer need. So I'm going to click on the promoted headers and I'm going to delete this step. It's going to ask me if I'm really sure. Yes, I am. Of course, now that we don't have our poorly classified headers anymore, the type which was linked to that step will also be broken, as we can see on screen per the error message above. So we can delete this step as well. Now we are left with just the source and our navigation, and we're ready to start cleaning our data. Now, even though we will not be touching upon M language today, it is worth mentioning that everything that happens in Power Query is coded in M language, so it is the underlying DNA to this system. If we look at the formula bar above, we can see everything Power Query is doing for us, even though we are not interacting with the code ourselves. This is M language. If you do not see this bar, click on the View tab and ensure the formula bar is checked. Now, while we are here, it is also worth pointing out that you can click to enable the column quality. This is going to give you details about every column in your table. So with this enabled, we can already see some valuable information about the numbers of errors and blank cells we have to contend with in our working document. Our first cleaning step is to make sure we have working headers so we can correctly identify our data types. We can begin by removing the first 4 rows because they provide no value in terms of our data's structure. We can do this by first interacting with our Home tab. This tab hosts the most fundamental steps in the cleaning process, like which rows and columns you want to keep. As you've guessed, we will click the Remove Rows dropdown, select Top Rows, and we're going to enter 4 and press Enter. Notice that our new step has been recorded into the Applied Steps pane on the right. So as you've guessed, the last step is going to reflect the data as it would be loaded into Excel once it's finalized. Our next step is to reinsert our header row, but this time correctly. So from the Transform Document group, I will click on the corresponding dropdown and select First Row as Header. That looks much better. Now you will see the change type was once again automatically plugged in by Power Query. This Power Query always jumping the gun and trying to be as helpful as possible on its own. However, this time, because our data is already in much better shape, it has done a much better job. I will, however, click into the Build column and change it to Currency. And yes, I want to replace the current with the data type that I am interested in. But as you just saw, you do have the option to create a separate step. Of course, I'm also going to do the same for rate, which is also a monetary value. Yes, I want to replace current, and no, I don't need an extra step for this one. Now, the next thing I want to do is to get rid of all of the blank rows. Just to experiment though, let's click into a further step up on the list before we do so. So I'm just going to click into the navigation, for example. Now I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and from the Remove Row dropdown, I'm going to select Remove Blank Rows. This time we get a prompt. Are you sure you want to insert an intermediate step? Yes, as you've guessed, you can reorder your steps by clicking and dragging them around or inserting steps at various positions. You want to be very careful when you do so because they might break the order and by proxy, your data structure. For example, remove top rows deletes the first 4 rows from the top of our table. So if I was to insert a step that somehow changes that number, our actual column headers will no longer be promoted correctly. In this case, I will say cancel, and I'm going to click back into our change type, which is our last step. Now I'm going to repeat the process and I'm going to remove the blank rows. Excellent. Now, speaking of empty rows, let's fix another bad practice that comes from Word documents. Yes, inserting only one instance of a repeating item can create some separation or white space and make it easier to read in a Word document. But again, that's not how data works in Excel. You want to avoid blank cells if at all possible. Now, both our project name and matter columns are guilty of this. We can Control plus click to select both. And for this one, we're going to click on the Transform tab. We're going to click on Fill, and we want to fill down. Amazing, right? Finally, we have two columns, 7 and 8. They're completely blank, so we can again Control click to select both. And from the Home tab, we can click the upper portion of the Remove Columns button to take care of it. Now our data is really starting to take shape. Of course, there are other very useful global change tools like replace values. For example, BriefStorm, not the most exciting project name, so we might want to update that to something else. We can click into the cell containing the value to select it the way we have right now. And then from the replace values dropdown, we can select replace values. So BriefStorm, of course, is already pre-selected. That's why we clicked into the cell to expedite the process a little bit. What do we want to replace it with? Let's go with an equally uninteresting name of Storm Vault. Perfect. Once I click OK, it has updated our list. And again, keep in mind, any other source that you point to, it will also automatically change that name. So you don't have to worry about keeping your data consistent across multiple data sources. Other handy tools will include Format, which, as you can see, is going to give you the option to change the case of your text automatically. You have the trim feature directly built in to get rid of extra spaces in front or trailing your data. You can also click the split column drop down, which is going to give you the ability to split by delimiter. You can also split by character length. So let's say you have a variety of 3-letter acronyms in front of some relevant data. You can split by 3 characters and then separate your relevant data into its own columns. If we pick columns that have monetary values, of course, we can also do calculations. We have statistical formulas. We have just your standard arithmetic formulas and a ton of other options. As always, I would strongly recommend you play with these options as much as possible to commit them to muscle memory. However, I will go over a few more pivotal features, pun intended, in just a few minutes after we are done with the data in front of us. Let's say you get the same horrible worksheet from the client every month, as we have stipulated at the beginning of the workshop. No worries, we can click back into the cog next to our source. And from there, we simply have to select the new document, and all of our steps will be applied in the exact sequence. So I'm going to hit browse, and I'm actually going to pick my project update sample. I'm going to hit import, and I'm going to press OK. Now, because we have source selected, this is only going to show us the actual document in question. So we have to go back to the very last step in our applied steps, and that is going to show us the new data already cleaned up, already transformed with all of the changes we have already made. The main change I've made was to replace the project name, so you can see, in fact, this is a completely different document. So I'm going to quickly swap back to my original data source, hit import, press OK, go back to our last step. We're back at it. There it is. Storm Vault is still the main name as we replace the original. So everything sticks, everything will persist. Okay, great. But what can we do with this data now that it is clean? Well, we can load it back into Excel. So from the Home tab, we have the Close and Load To button. If you hit the drop down, you can see we have two options, close and load and close and load to. If we choose that one, we're going to get a variety of different options. If you had just clicked load it, it would have thrown it into a new worksheet as a table based on what we're seeing as our default choices right now. But I just wanted to show you this prompt because you do have the option to load it directly into a pivot report. You can create a pivot chart. You can plug it into an existing worksheet. And at the very bottom there, we have add this to the data model. So again, we're now tying all of the concepts together. We learned about Power Pivot and how you can use data models, link them together, create relationships between various tables, and then bring them together into a Power Pivot table. And so we can do the same thing with the data that we've cleaned through Power Query first. In this case, I'm just going to plug it in as a table into a new worksheet. So there is our default choice. It has pushed us back to Excel and we have our table, and you will see that it has named our table and this sheet in accordance with our query name. And of course, we can change these names if we want. If we want to change the name of the table, we can simply click into the table name field above and replace it with whatever we like. And at the bottom, if we want to change the worksheet name, we can right click on it and rename. We can just keep it as project for the time being. Now you will also notice we have a new panel on the right side of the screen called Queries and Connections. We only have one connection, which is of course our project worksheet. However, if we hover over the project, we will see some relevant data, including and most importantly, the time the data was last refreshed. So for example, if the source document has not been refreshed in a while, we can hit the refresh button in the panel and our data will automatically update to reflect the changes. Double-clicking the query itself, so project, will launch you back into the Power Query editor, and also hovering over and just hitting the edit button at the bottom there of our gray shaded area is also going to bring you back into the Power Query editor. Now, if you ever lose this panel, so let's say it gets closed or you get sent a spreadsheet where this method of data management was implemented and you want to bring that back, well, we can click on the Data tab and then simply click on the Queries and Connections button. That should bring back the panel. As promised, our next example is going to feature some more of the core transformation features. So going to File, I have the Pivot, Unpivot, and Transform. And this time around, we're going to have a table which we're going to unpivot. Of course, I will explain what that means in just a second. Now, since our table is already in our existing document, again, all I have to do is once I click anywhere in the table, going from the Data tab, I will simply click on From Table Range. That's going to bring us straight into the Power Query editor. Now, as you've guessed from the name of our table, we're going to unpivot some of the columns in this table. What does that mean? With Power Pivot, we have the ability to shuffle our data around like a Rubik's Cube. Unpivot will convert columns into rows, which I cannot understate the importance of for data analysis purposes. If we click into the Unpivot dropdown, which we can find by going into Transform, and there is our Unpivot, you can see that we have three options. The first lets you unpivot selected columns, and the second lets you unpivot all but the selected columns. The third option is self-explanatory, but has a somewhat hidden drawback. Let me explain. The first two options are global selection methods, which means they will take into account the addition of new data. For example, if I use option 2 to unpivot all but the selected columns, if I were to add a 2025 column, for example, to the original data, then hit the refresh button, it will automatically be taken into account. However, if I manually target only a specific column or columns, then this will remove that automatic sync of future data and continue to target only my initial manual selection. I hope that makes sense. So let's make some mistakes and see what happens. I'm going to unpivot all of the columns except for the partner column. So we have the partner column currently selected. I will unpivot other columns. Whoops, what do we immediately notice as being incorrect? That's right, we left the total columns in our data, which is now no longer relevant to us. So how do we fix this? Well, as we already learned, we can click on the X to remove our previous step, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. And instead, I'm going to select the total column. I'm going to go back to my Home tab and I will remove that column. Again, this will not affect our source data. It is purely for the method of how we're going to ingest it for our own purposes. So now if I go back and transform and I unpivot other columns, much better. As you can see, it has converted all the columns into individual rows for each of our fictional partners. This data is far more friendly and far more flexible if the goal is to create a pivot table for data analyses. We have a few other things we need to resolve, however. Our new column headers were auto-inserted by Power Query and need to be fixed. Double-clicking into the header is going to allow us to replace the values as needed. So for attributes, I'm going to, again, double-click and change this one to years. And values, I'm going to change to build. I also want to change build to have the proper data type, which means the currency is going to be selected. Again, if you click on the icon to the left of the name, you can choose what type of data is actually stored there. Now let's break another rule and load this into our existing worksheet so we can see it side by side with the source data. So again, how do we do that? From the Home tab, we're going to go to Load, Close and Load To. That's going to give us the option to choose the existing worksheet. And yeah, we'll put it in as a table. Let's throw it in column I, for example. There we go. Now, a best practice is to generally avoid loading your data into the same sheet as the source, especially if you're expecting to add additional content to it. You never want to be in the situation where adding source data overwrites your clean data. Now, speaking of adding new data, let's add a new column for 2025. And a shortcut for doing that is to press Control, Shift, and the plus button. So I'm going to select my total column. Again, I'm going to press Control, Shift, plus. That's going to throw in a new column. And because we're in a table, we can see that it has already added the column header for us. Now, just to add some quick placeholder data, all I'm going to do is take the number from the 2024 year and multiply it by 1.03. That should give us, again, just some random data that we can work with. Now, if we go back to our data tab, we have a refresh all button. And if you're going to be using this, I would recommend that you right click and add this to your quick access toolbar. And you have a variety of different options. You can refresh all, you can just refresh what you're working on. And you also have the ability to, of course, refresh directly from the panel on the right. You can see a small refresh button to the right of our Unpivot title there as well. So the moment I hit this button, look at that, our 2025 year has already been imported into our data. Perfect. Now, if I wanted to create a pivot table instead, it's very easy. All we have to do if we want to change the method of our output is to right click on our query in the panel, and we have the Load To button still available to us. We can change to whatever it is that we need. In this case, I will choose a pivot table report, and let's throw that one into a brand new sheet. There is our pivot table. And then again, I have my columns available. I can go ahead and plug these however I like and sort them in whatever order I like for analysis purposes. You also said that we can flip data like a Rubik's Cube. If that is the case, what are the other options? Well, I'm very glad you asked. If I hover over our data here, I can go to Edit to jump back into our Power Query editor. And I'm just going to delete a few of these steps. Let's get rid of everything but our very beginning section. So what does transpose do? From the transform menu, if I hit transpose, you will see that it will let you flip rows into columns and columns back into rows. If that is the case, and we know what transpose does and what unpivot does, then what does pivot do? We have pivot column available right there as well. Well, pivot is going to let you turn unique values from one column into new column headers, aggregating data as needed. What does that mean? What does that look like? Let's jump out from the editor. I'm going to discard my changes and we're going to go into our pivot example right here. Again, we can click anywhere into the table and select from our data tab from table range. Now, what I want to do is to have my months as the column headers. So I will begin by selecting the month column. Again, from the transform tab, I will click on pivot column. And here we get a few options. You get to choose from the first drop down which values will be displayed under your new column header. In this case, I want the values from my existing value column to be displayed, so I will pick those. You also have an advanced option drop down, which will let you choose how you want to aggregate, if at all. In this case, I will choose don't aggregate. My existing item column will now be moved to the forefront when I press the OK button. There we go. Keep in mind, you are not limited to one of these functions. You can combine them to quite literally flip your data like a Rubik's Cube, wherein, for example, you could first transpose your table, then unpivot certain columns. So for our final example, let's do just that. Again, I'm going to close out of our edit mode here. And we're going to select the Everything tab. Now we have one of those horrid tables again with multiple levels of headers. Why does this keep happening? Unfortunately, this time the instructions were to keep all the information. So what are we going to do? Well, again, same process to bring in the data first. We're just going to click in the from table range. And the goal is to have January and February appear for each of the relevant columns of hours and build. Now, if that is the case, let's first transpose our data so we can flip it on its side. And this will let us fill down for the 2 months in question. So transform, and we're going to transpose. Now you can see that we've jumbled up our data quite well, but in column 1, we have January and February. We only want those to, again, apply for the hours and the build, so we're going to fill down. We don't have to worry about the 4 rows above because those are, again, representative of the other columns in our data. So fill down is what we're going to pick. Again, simple step. There we have our duplication for the 2 columns in question. Okay, great, but they are still separate from the rest of our data, and just because we don't need the top rows doesn't mean we can leave them as null. So how is that going to work? Well, in Power Query, you are not able to merge rows, but what you can do is merge columns, which is exactly what we're going to do. So which columns are we going to merge? Well, the ones containing our headings in column 2. Again, Control-click to select both. And we can click on the Merge Columns button. It's going to ask us to insert a separator. The best practice here is to always pick a separator that is unique from the others that are being used in your table. This way, if we need to split your data later, you won't have to contend with capturing unnecessary items. For this example, I'm going to pick a space and break my own rules because we're not going to keep the merged column since we will need to transpose it again, so we can flip it back in the order that we want, as you will see in just a second. So my separator is going to be a space. And what do I want my new column to be named? I can just leave it as merged. Again, we're not going to keep it, so it is just a placeholder name. I'm going to hit OK. There we go. Now, this space has also been inserted in front of the column names for the first 4 rows. How do we fix that? Well, we already learned that we have a format tool that's going to let us get rid of the spacing in front and or after our data. And if you recall, that's going to happen from the format dropdown where we can select trim. So as just mentioned, now that we have fixed our headers, we will flip them again using transpose. If we look at our column headers, we still have that junk placeholder. So how do we fix that? You got it. We could go home and use our header as first row button from the home tab, but you'll see for convenience, it has also been included on the transform tab. So we have our use first row as header tab right there. That has fixed our issue. Now, for the most part, I really wanted you to get used to the ribbon and the various options available throughout. But if you ever right click on the columns or your data in general, you're going to see you have much of the same common functionality built into your right click. So now you have a variety of different options as far as how you want to customize your workflow. Okay, so now we have Jan hours and Jan build and Feb hours and Feb build. Fantastic. This is exactly what we want. But what now? We are going to select the 4 columns containing our data and we're going to unpivot them. This time we're going to click and hold down Shift to select a range. And again, from the unpivot dropdown, we're going to select unpivot only selected columns. Let's go a step further and use the other tool we talked about earlier, split. In this example, we're going to select only the attributes column. And again, we're going to split by the number of characters. How many characters? Well, only 3. We're only wanting to separate the names of the months from hours and or build. And how do we want to split this? Well, we want to pick as far left as possible. So we're only targeting the 3 characters to the leftmost of our column. Once we've made our selection, I can hit OK. Perfect. Now this has also left some spaces that we can clearly see in our attributes to column. We can select that. Again, go to format, go to trim, get rid of those spaces, and we're good to go. And now as our final step, we're going to pivot our attributes column, our second one. Again, we're going to choose the actual values. We will leave our aggregation as sum. That's fine. We can press OK. What has this done? Well, look at that. We now have our hours and our build columns back in order. And all we have left to do is rename our attributes one column to months. And again, you can do that just by double clicking straight into the header. Of course, now that our data is clean and it is in a shape that we can work with, we can load it back into Excel and work with it normally. So let's do that just for comparison sake. I'm going to go to home. I'm going to load to. Let's do it in the existing worksheet, and I'm going to throw it immediately below our existing call or a table as our brand new table. So you can see the various differences in layout. Again, our new table is going to work much better in terms of analyzing and or using pivot tables to break down specific components as you would normally. Now that seems like a lot of work. Wouldn't it have been easier to do this manually? Sure, it may have been easier and faster to do it manually, but if you're getting the same exact table every week, month, quarter, or at any other interval, if you do it this way, you will only ever have to do it once. Speaking of automation and intervals, let's say we receive reports every month and we want to add all of this data to a master sheet, but we are not about to copy paste things because that lends itself to human error. So we're going to use Power Query to do 99% of the work for us. Now here I have a folder with a few months worth of data, and it is important to note that while you can have multiple files in a folder and pick and choose the ones you are targeting the way we've done so far, it is highly recommended that you dedicate the folder in question only to the files meant to be part of this specific action. Now I've already opened February, which we have in the background right here, and we can see it's just very basic. All we have is 3 columns with plain text. The other 2 months are exactly the same. What we want to do is to bring these into Power Query, and we're going to follow the same pattern we have so far during this workshop. So in a new workbook, which I have going right here, we're going to go to the Data tab, and now we're going to go to Get Data from File, and this is where we select from Folder. So there I have my folder selected in my File Explorer. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to press Open. It's going to identify our 3 Excel files, and like before, we have a lot of different options as far as combining or loading our data, but we will stick with our original choice. Just keep it simple. We're going to transform the data first. Now, when we initially see the screen, it is showing the metadata of the files, which is not what we might have expected. But remember, we have to look in our query settings, and we can see the only thing we have in our applied steps is the source. This means that this is only showing us information about the actual files themselves. That's fine. We can verify again that everything is as expected. Now, in our content column, we see a button with 2 downward arrows. Clicking this will prompt us to combine our files. With our Combine Files prompt now active, at the very top, we can see that we have a drop-down for our sample file. By default, it's going to be the first file selected. However, you can choose any of the files as essentially your base template. The logic here is that all files in our folder have the same formatting. So if we adjust just one of them and we do all the transformations as necessary, then it will apply to the rest of the files exactly in the same way. They will adopt the same changes. In this case, first file is fine. I will leave it as is. Now, when I click on Sheet 1, this will show us the actual structure of our data that we are expecting, which is of course only for our sample, our first file. And once I press OK, now it's actually combining our multiple sources together. And in our queries panel on the left, we have a few automatically generated entries. Let me expand this a little bit more so we can see exactly what we're looking at. Now, the 2 we are primarily interested in is the transform sample file. Again, if you need to make modifications to the formatting using the techniques we learned thus far, this is where you would do so. And anything you do here would be applied to the rest of the files in the folder. The second container is going to be immediately below, which, as you've guessed, is going to output our merge, which is the data from all of our tables, as well as new columns with the file names. Now, usually it is fine to delete the source name file, but in this case, because we don't actually have a column in our data that identifies the month and the year, it comes in quite handy. We can outsmart the computer a little bit here, and instead we're going to transform this data by splitting it by delimiter. Since the period then identifies the XLSX file format, that is what we can target by delimiter. This time we're going to choose custom. We're going to use the period, and we're going to target the rightmost delimiter in our column. We only have one, but we might as well do this the correct way. Once we press OK, There we have it. We don't actually need source 2 as a column. We can just remove that column out of there and simply double click in here. You can call this date to make it simple. Now, as usual, it's a good practice to look through the actual data types and make sure anything that's supposed to be currency is currency. Anything that's supposed to be just basic numbers is just basic numbers. And date can just be text because we are in fact pulling this from the file name itself. So the dates themselves don't actually represent a date field per se. Now at this point we are done and we can load our data into a new worksheet, which is exactly what we're going to do. Selecting the close and load, just like before, we're going to choose table, new worksheet is fine, press OK. But here is where the magic happens. Let's paste the next report into this folder. So going back into my folder structure, here I have an April report for 2024. I'm simply going to copy and paste this into my actual folder that we are targeting in our query. And now if I come back to my spreadsheet, again, if I go to that data tab and I have that refresh all button, or again, you can refresh the data however you choose, this will automatically plug in our April 2024 entries. And just to make extra sure, again, I'm going to hover over our source there. I'm going to hit edit and we're going to make sure that April is in there. How would you do that? Well, we're going to click on the source button at the very top. We refresh and there is April. This is just an example, but I hope it has shown you that you can fully automate workflows for data that comes your way in any number of sources and any number of formats. As long as it is consistent and it always comes in the same setup every single time, if there's repetition involved, you don't have to do the repetition part. Set it up once, sync, refresh, and you're good to go. That will do it for this workshop. Thank you very much for your participation. Again, Power Query is a very big topic. This video is pushing 50 minutes already, and we haven't even talked about M language, which is absolutely incredibly powerful. Of course, you can customize anything if you're working at the base level M language itself. There is a lot to learn, and I hope this serves as a good introduction to get you automating some of the more repetitive and menial tasks in your workflow. Thank you again, and see you next time.